Rudyard Griffiths here, the publisher of The Hub. Welcome to this Up to Speed, our regular video series here on YouTube, where we're providing quick commentary and analysis on breaking news and events. We do this each and every day, reaching out to some of our best contributors and thinkers, again, to bring you hopefully some new analysis and insights on breaking news. Extremely fortunate to have on the program Livio Di Matteo. He's a professor of economics sorry, I'm gonna take that again. He's a professor of economics remind me of your university. Why am I blanking on this, Livio?
I'm at Lakehead University in
Exactly.
Thunder Bay, Ontario.
Great old Thunder Bay, Ontario, and you are a regular contributor to the Hub. And I come to you in the Hub for your analysis of economics, finance, particularly debts and deficits. And Livio, let's begin there. I wonder what your reaction is to the news reports that have surfaced in the last 24 hours that the federal government of Justin Trudeau is considering what's been characterized as pandemic COVID levels of spending, public spending, in relationship to a potential U.S. tariff on Canadian exports.
Well, that's an interesting policy response. I mean, my expectation would have been that the policy response would have involved some type of trade-related countermeasures, measures to boost productivity by removing, provincial trade barriers, to make more use of our effective market size, which is over 40 million people. A pandemic level response is a bit disconcerting, especially if you go back and review exactly what happened during the pandemic in terms of the size of the response.
Now, Livio, you've done some great work at the Hub, kind of breaking down Canada's indebtedness. And you've often pointed out that, well, the federal government, in terms of a variety of metrics of debt to GDP or other things you might want to look at, unfunded liabilities, doesn't stand up too badly versus other countries around the world. But the challenge in Canada is the extent to which we are a heavily leveraged and levered economy with a lot of debt across provinces that have been equally profligate during COVID and after. What I'm struggling with, Livio, is how could the federal government and how could Doug Ford, who's now gone to the polls here in Ontario with a premise that he needs a mandate to spend, in his words, tens of billions of dollars on a tariff response, how does that all happen? How do we have the opportunity to once again engage in a kind of debt spree? I thought there were some limits here, some economic I don't know, walls that you could start to run into given this scale of spending over this period of time?
Well, I mean, I think the best way to try to start to answer that is to look at exactly what happened during the pandemic. So if you go back to fiscal year 2019-20, which is the year right before the big pandemic surge, let's just take the federal government because the response of both governments during levels of government during the pandemic, the federal government was by far the larger uh, amount of spending increase. The provinces did increase their spending more, but a lot of it was driven by federal transfers. So if you just focus on the federal government, in 2019-20, the federal government was uh, spending about $363 billion. In fiscal year 2021, which is, the pandemic, which kicks in, essentially just after the first quarter of that fiscal year, spending for that fiscal year goes up to $629 billion. So essentially, spending went up by about $266 billion. So the deficit went from, 29 billion in 2019-20 to 312 billion, an exceedingly large increase. The debt to GDP ratio basically went up 10 percentage points from about 36 to about 46%. And the deficit to GDP ratio went from about 1.3% to 12%. So I mean that's a fairly significant increase. And so if you're looking at a COVID era, COVID level response, and you want to take that as the benchmark, that would be a rather large increase in our spending. If you start looking at some of the numbers, basically, if you did that, our deficit, which is at about 48 billion going into this fiscal year, would suddenly go up to well over 300 billion. Um, our net debt is at about 1.4 trillion. It would reach about 1.7 trillion dollars. And our debt to GDP ratio would probably go up from the current roughly 44%, which is where we are based on the last federal economic statement, it would go up to 54%. Okay, so I mean,
Big
that's
numbers.
just from the 1 year of spending. Then the year after, spending did come down, but the deficit was still $90 billion dollars.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would be a fairly large fiscal hit. Can the federal government do it? Well, I mean, our debt to GDP ratio has been higher than 54% historically. I mean, the one time where we hit the debt wall was in the early 90s when we hit about 72, 73%, something like that. So there is room for that to a certain extent. However, it's still a lot of spending, and I guess what you really have to watch out for is that when you look at that big increase in pandemic spending, only in the end, about half of it was for the pandemic,
Yeah.
in terms of either income support for workers affected by the pandemic and health spending.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, a lot of that other spending does seem to have been taken as an opportunity to expand the federal fiscal footprint, so to speak, through a variety of other programs. So, I mean, going back about a decade, the federal spending, the GDP ratio was at about 14%. You're now at about 17. There's been a sort of permanent ramping up of the federal fiscal footprint. And
Yeah.
so again, can we afford that? Well, I mean, as long as you're able to borrow internationally, I suppose you can.
But Livio, on
And
that
in
point, the
terms
key
of
thing
our,
during the
sorry,
pandemic was that the Bank of Canada stepped in and through quantitative easing purchased large amounts of Canadian and provincial debt, artificially suppressing uh, the cost of that debt if it had to have been sold into to domestic buyers and international buyers. And I guess my question is, with a depreciating Canadian dollar, with a growing spread between U.S. and Canadian yields, because the American economy is much stronger, there seems to be a renewed threat of inflation. Their central bank is on pause. Ours is cutting rates. Livio, I guess, do debts and deficits matter? I mean, is this old school thinking to believe that bad things can happen when you spend too much? Because right now it seems as if our political class, both here at Queen's Park in Ontario and in Ottawa on the banks of the Rideau River, seem to feel that a lot of this is consequence free, and that their freedom for action here in terms of large scale spending in the tens and hundreds of billions of dollars potentially isn't constrained. It isn't constrained by the bond market. It isn't constrained by interest rates. Um, Am I missing something?
well, I mean, there's always consequences to actions. If you look at the last run up in spending, I mean, look at what happened. You ended up with a rather large bout of inflation, and then interest rates had to go up to bring it down. The really low interest rates through the quantitative easing that came about led to a big flare up in housing prices. I mean, there
Mm-hmm.
was all kinds of consequences to the fiscal and monetary actions of that period. Now, in dealing with the tariffs, I mean, history never repeats itself exactly. I don't actually believe they're going to engage in that same level of spending. I mean, if you look at the pandemic, GDP dropped about 5% during that 1 year. Employment dropped by 3 million people, but a lot of that employment drop was through lockdowns and other types of restrictions. It wasn't exactly a response to a market downturn. So if the estimates of the impact of tariffs are to be, you know, taken at face value, you could see a drop in GDP of 4 to 5%, but the employment impact should not be as much. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the sort of the worst case scenario for Ontario is like 500,000 jobs. Ontario is roughly half the economy. So you're looking at a third of the potential employment impact through the impact of tariffs. And So the response definitely shouldn't be at a pandemic level style. But what is unfortunate is that they are using the idea of a large pandemic style response to this. I mean, in a sense, we don't really want to overreact on either the tariff response side or trade side or on the fiscal and monetary side to this. We first have to see what's going to happen. And you can't the day after suddenly decide you're going to, run $100 billion deficit. I don't really think that's a responsible way of generating the policy response because our policy response is going to have to shift because what comes out of Washington
Right.
seems to shift on almost an hourly basis. I mean, first there was going to be a 25% tariff, then there wasn't, and then we're
Hmm.
going to review it in the spring, and now it's going to happen Saturday, and now the last thing that just flashed across my iPad, well, it's going to be a two-stage response. There's going to be some tariffs, this weekend, and then more tariffs later.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I think the best thing most of our policymakers could do is just really zip up.
Well
Borrowing
said.
from
Well
Theodore
said.
Roosevelt,
Yeah.
it's really important to speak softly and carry whatever stick you can manage to carry to beat this thing off,
Here,
and
here.
to stop publicly trumpeting whatever response you're going to make. I think the Americans would get much more nervous if we suddenly went silent
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Walk
waited for them
quietly
to move.
and carry a paddle, preferably a heavy one. Livia DiMatteo, economics professor, hub contributor from Lakehead University. Thank you so much for coming on the program today and all your great writing and analysis at the hub, which listeners, viewers can see right now at www.thehub.ca.